Yeah, it is time for our fourth speaker for today. And again, one more time, before I begin, I'd like to have a reminder, those questions were fantastic. So if we could blend in, please, the URL QR code, da muss ich ein bisschen langsam sprechen. And of course, also the Zoom Q&A tool. When you have your questions, please continue doing the great job and putting those in there. We appreciate that. Good. It is my great pleasure to introduce, first of all, our subject for the topic for our fourth and final panel for today. And that is Road to Openness, a web-based open science self-assessment tool for research performing organizations. And our speaker will be Dr. Verena Heise. Verena, are you there?
I am indeed, yes.
Hello, welcome. And where are you right now? What city are you coming from?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd love to say that I'm at a beach in Hawaii because I'm a freelancer nowadays. No, but I'm actually in a small city called Gladbeck in the Ruhr area in Germany.
Oh, I've been to Gladbeck, and that's certainly very different than Hawaii. But
very different indeed.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then we'll get started. Dr. Verena Heise, she's currently a freelance researcher and consultant for open science here in Germany. As a biomedical scientist by training, she is very passionate about developing training and infrastructure to improve reliability of research results, and enable translation into clinical practice. To facilitate top-down engagement from institutional leaders and culture change, she and some of her colleagues are currently developing Road to Openness, also known as RTO. RTO is a web-based assessment tool that helps institutions to evaluate current open science activities and offers recommendations for a strategic opening to develop institutional training, infrastructure, and incentive systems for open science. So to tell us more about this, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Verena Heise, and we'll give you a welcoming round of applause.
Thank you so much, David.
You're
That's
welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you. So Road to Openness, I shortened the title a bit. I thought it was way too long. And I'll try and explain our tool to you today. So thanks very much for having me. Before I start, I'd just like to start with a disclosure slide. I just think that's good practice normally. And when I give this talk to other audiences that are not an open science crowd, I tend to say this slide is just to say that I'm a very biased person. I'm someone who really believes that we need to push open science forward, and I work with lots of different organizations in funded positions, but also in unfunded positions to make that happen. And so that's just a bit about me. But actually today is much more about the tool that we're developing. And before I explain the tool to you, I really just want to focus briefly on the team that we're developing this with. So it's not just me. It's a fantastic team of lots of different open science experts. We have people from lots of different places in Germany and also in Austria who are working with us on this. And this is funded by the Stifterverband in Germany, by their InnoSci program, and we're very grateful for their continued support. So about the project, how did we get together in the first place? I think it's a really interesting crowd that we got together to develop this tool. And we came together because of a Future Lab, a program that was organized by the Stifterverband, where basically we ran a couple of brainstorming events to think really about open practices in higher education. And the big question that we tried to answer in our brainstormings was, how can we support open pioneers to develop broad impact in their institutions to strengthen the societal impact of science? And really, Road to Openness is basically one of the outcomes of this Future Lab. And it's the solution that we tried to pursue over the last 12 months or so. And really, we thought about what does supporting pioneers actually mean. So I think the way that this normally works, especially with sort of taking up open science practices in institutions, is through bottom-up mechanisms. I think a lot of us work in institutions or used to work in institutions where we really try to push for culture change. And sometimes we run into this barrier that really there isn't a lot of support from the top down. So really what we thought we should do with our tool is really try to engage institutional leaders and develop top-down support so that we can get this together with a sort of bottom-up approach and maybe affect institutional change through those mechanisms. And really, how do we support institutional leaders? So we have a couple of questions that we thought we should answer for institutional leaders. So first of all, what actually is open science? I think this is something that's actually also an interesting question for this kind of crowd. what do we consider to be part of open science practices? And I'll give our answer to that question in just a second. Why should we care as an institution about open science practices, not just as individuals or as individual researchers? Who should be involved in institutional implementation? And also, how can we actually do this as an institution? So what do we need? What kind of processes do we need in place? And so really our tool is about helping institutional leaders to answer those questions. So what's our tool? Well, basically the idea is that we have a freely available online tool that is for anyone to use anonymously. So we don't need the name of your institution. We don't need your name to be able to use this tool. And really what we're trying to do is really guide people through the process of developing open science infrastructure, open science practices, open science training. And we do this through two stages. So the first stage of the tool is we just provide information about different open science practices. And also the more important part is the self-assessment. So self-assessment is basically just a web-based questionnaire where you answer lots of questions about your current institutional practices, what kind of training, what kind of infrastructure do you have available. And then the second stage really is to provide information to plan institutional development in the specific areas that an institution is interested in. I also want to stress what Road2Openness isn't, at least it's not currently an external audit system. It's also not to be used for objective comparisons. So it's definitely not supposed to be a ranking. We're not trying to rank institutions here. This is really for institutions to think about their self-assessment and think about what they want to do. I think Rima Maria Rahal's talk this morning actually illustrated very nicely why we probably don't need more competition. We don't need another ranking for institutions to compete against one another. What we need in the open science arena especially, I think, is more collaboration, more cooperation. So a ranking is definitely not what we're aiming for here. And I think it's also important to note that we do not have access to the data that institutions enter here because we really want this to be freely available for anyone to use. We don't want any barriers, and we really value that people want to use this, but we don't want to, sell the data or do anything with the data. And so let me answer the question first: what is open science, or what are we looking at with our tool in this case? So with our tool, we're looking at lots of different areas of open science. The one that's obviously probably most well known to everyone is open access, and we define open access not just as open access to publications, but also to data and materials. But we also look at other areas. So we look at citizen science, which ties in very nicely with the previous talk that we've just heard. So citizen science is about the involvement of citizens in research projects. We look at open innovation, and innovation processes from institutions tend to be quite closed at the moment. So the question is, how can we open up those? We look at open educational resources, and we also look at replicability, which is basically about the question, how do we implement good research practices? How do we improve the reliability of research results? And then when you look at the inner circle, we also have these two cross-cutting themes. One is open governance, which is really about how transparent and how participatory your decision-making processes are in your institution. And then it's also about open culture. So this is specifically about incentivizing open science practices and also thinking about responsible research assessment. So basically, all the things that Rima talked about this morning is something that we want to cover as part of this open culture bit. And so I thought I just wanted to show you a bit more how what the sort of stage one looks like. So what kind of questions we're asking. And instead of doing open access, which I think is a bit boring by now, I thought we should focus on citizen science, also to tie in with the previous talk that we've just heard. So when you go to stage one of our tool, you on the one hand get information about what citizen science actually is, but also about why you should implement citizen science in your institution. So why is it good? And then we have lots of different sub-themes within those open science areas that we're looking at. So for example, when we look at the sub-theme strategy within citizen science, we basically ask, so the way that the tool works is that we always ask you to select the statement that most closely resembles the sort of status of your institution. And so in the strategy part, you can look at whether or not your institution has a citizen science strategy. Is it planning one? Or does it have one already? Citizen science might also be part of an existing open science or public engagement strategy, for example. So you select the statement that basically most closely resembles your institutional status. And we have that for lots of different areas. We have that for training, for example. So here you decide whether or not, or you say whether or not citizen science is included as part of student training, for example. Then we look at infrastructure. What types of infrastructure do you have? For example, do you have an institutional citizen science platform where projects can be advertised, or do you advertise projects that are available on external platforms? And so what you get in the end, after going through all those different questions, is basically an output that looks a bit like this. So here in green, you see the areas where the institution is probably quite advanced. So they answer the questions basically to say that we're quite at an advanced level. So for example, open access and open educational resources are green, so they're quite advanced in this case. Then in amber, we see areas that are maybe not as advanced, but where they are quite good. And in red, we see areas that they might want to improve on. But I think it's also important to note that red doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. We recognize that institutions have lots of different priorities. They have lots of different sort of funding schemes. They have lots of different focuses for what they're trying to achieve. So it's really important that it's down to the institution to decide what they want to improve on. Red just shows you that, maybe there are areas that you could do a bit more on, but if you don't want to do that, that's totally fine by us. And also within the different areas, we also look then at the different sub-themes, if you like. So we have strategy, we have projects, infrastructure, training, and also financing. And then we have sort of an evaluation of each of these different areas too. And then when we come to stage 2, basically, based on the answers you gave us in stage 1, you will see the information that's available to you. So, for example, you might want to be looking at citizen science infrastructure. You saw, well, we're not doing that well. So we will provide you with information for how you could improve different areas of infrastructure for citizen science. And if you said in stage 1, where we already have a citizen science platform, you will never get the option to actually look at information on developing a citizen science platform because that's not relevant to you. But in this stage, you will just see the sort of information bits that we think might be of interest to you. And then you can select the ones that you want to focus on. So in this case, you might want to focus on developing guidelines or developing support systems, but you don't really care about developing a platform or strategy. So you just pick those two, and you will just be shown the information for this specific area. And the information we show you is on the one hand based on good practice examples from other institutions, and also based on the expertise from the people in our group who are developing this tool. And you will get information on sort of what kind of content you might want in those guidelines, how you could develop those guidelines in your institution, and also what kind of stakeholders should be involved in developing those guidelines. So you might think, well, this is a great idea, but does it actually work? That's a really good question that I would like to answer with a definite yes. But actually, we're still piloting this tool. So what we did, we started the project at the beginning of August of last year. And then in the autumn, we selected 3 universities for a pilot scheme. And this piloting has been in progress since November. And so what we're currently focusing on is really testing the tool with an institution at an institution to see if it actually works. So that's what we're doing now at the end of March, beginning of April. And so hopefully by the end of April, when this project ends, we will have a really cool prototype available that anyone can use, and we'll put this online for anyone to use. But during the pilot phase that we've already run with the universities, we've actually learned a couple of really useful things. Also, when we looked at the applications of universities who wanted to pilot the tool. So what we learned about university leadership is that their open science definition is actually relatively narrow. So it seems to be mostly about open access publishing, and maybe open data is a bit of that too. But when you look at the definition that we're using, it's obviously much broader than that. So I think there's a huge scope for thinking much more about what kind of definitions we're working with, and also for educating leadership about the types of open science that we're interested in. Also, I think the impression that we get from university leadership is that there's a huge interest in the topic itself, but the scope or the scale of the challenge is often unclear. I think what's clear to many of us experts is that open science practices and implementing those requires a huge culture change within institutions, but that's not necessarily so clear to people in leadership positions. And also when it comes to the tool that we're currently developing itself, I think what we've seen is the responsibilities for different open science themes is very distributed across leadership. but also across different areas of the institution. And I tend to say it takes a village to find out more about the open science activities within institutions because it's so distributed. So this is definitely one of the sort of outcomes of the first process of showing our tool to the institutions, that they realize, hang on, maybe we need to get a much clearer view of what's actually happening. Maybe we need a single point of contact who actually knows more about the open science activities within our institution, because they are happening. And that's what we saw in the conversations with the open science communities at our pilot universities. There are open science experts at all of those pilot universities, but unfortunately, there's very little networking either within the open science teams or across them. So there are individuals that are really interested in those topics, and they are experts in those topics, but they are not involved in any decision making. They are also not involved in any sort of developing of infrastructure, or they develop training for their own purposes, but not for the purpose of the institution. And I think one of the really interesting feedbacks that we got is that obviously the culture of openness is difficult to create in the current academic system, and this is something that's obviously to be expected. But also, I think it's important to note that we need to create intrinsic motivation for working openly. I think there are a lot of people in the open science communities who are hesitant about getting top-down requirements, getting institutional leaders involved. That always means, oh my God, they will force some sort of idea on us. And that's obviously not the idea. The idea is that we get a sort of a top-down engagement, but they work together with a bottom-up crowd, the experts that are already at their institution, and they develop solutions together. So I think what we've seen at the pilot universities so far is that we've successfully started the conversation on open science practices. We do need new infrastructures within those universities to keep the conversation going. And I think we also need to focus more on the why of open science. Why are we doing this? Why do we care about this? But also, how do we make this happen, and how do we get top-down and bottom-up engagement together? There are a number of open questions, but I think in the interest of time, I will skip those. I think what we're really hoping is that our tool can be used as a signpost and doesn't lead to a dead end, I guess. I hope that'll be very interesting to a lot of institutions to work with. I think it's really important to say as well that this is not just for universities. This is to be used by any research performing organization. It's a very sort of open tool. So the questions can be answered by pretty much any institution. And just a brief outlook on what we're trying to do in the future. So one of the things that we really saw over the last couple of months is that there are lots of different organizations and institutions that are doing amazingly well on open science and also on culture change, but they don't share that information. So we would really like to provide more open case studies, come up with open science case studies, so that other institutions can learn from institutions that have already gone through the process. We might also want to offer audit services or consultancy services alongside the self-assessment tool. It's still one of the outstanding questions whether or not this can be used as a standalone tool, or whether it actually needs some sort of advice from experts. And one of the sort of future ideas that we have as well is whether we could ask institutions to donate their anonymized data for academic research purposes. It's not that we want to do research with the data, but that we want to give the data to academics so that they can actually do some really useful research on how the system is developing as a whole. And also, we're really keen on collaborating with people who are developing automated openness indicators. I think there's a lot of stuff happening in that space, and they could be very useful to integrate within our tool too. And I think in the end, it's really important for us to say that we're trying to provide a not-for-profit service for research performing organizations, and we're basically here to help the community. So if you have other ideas, if you want to get involved, please do so. I'm afraid that our website currently is only available in German. It's one of the first things I will work on when we are done with the pilot, to translate things into English. But you can always write an email in English. We do speak English, as you can see. So please get in touch. We're interested to hear from you if you want to help with community feedback. We're happy to send you information when we release R2O officially. We're always looking for collaborators. And just in case that you have a bit of funding and would like to help us, we'd love to hear from you too. So that's us. And I'm looking forward to questions. And I'll be there for the Meet the Speaker session as well. So I hope to have a chat with you about our tool. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much. Really a very interesting presentation. Love it also about the Open Science Award. Fantastic idea. We do have a couple of questions, but I do want to remind people one last time, if you want to. Thank you very much, Malta. We have here our link for the QR code to ask questions. And of course, also in the Zoom, you have the Q&A tool as well. Before we begin the questions, I had a quick question. You had mentioned 3 partner universities that you all are working with. Could you tell us maybe one of their names and also generally the reaction? Because I know a lot of times universities are very traditional. You talked about that culture there. Have they been more like, we're excited about it, let's do it, or a little bit more skeptical?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I can tell you exactly who those are. So we are working with the RWTH in Aachen. We're working with Potsdam University, and we're working with a HAW in Jena, the Ernst AB Hochschule.
Okay.
So we have a huge breadth of different types of universities, and that was we picked that specifically because we wanted to see if the tool works for different types of universities as well. So that was one of our goals. And also they are at sort of different stages of their open science development. So that was one of our aims as well, to get sort of universities that are more at the beginning of their open science development and those that are a bit more advanced, so that we can sort of see whether the tool works for really everyone.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. Good. Then I think we're ready to begin our Q&A, question and answer round. The first one is here. How long does the assessment process take?
Yeah, fantastic question.
Yeah, very good.
So yeah, we're trying to get this down to 1 hour. So basically 1 hour to go through the questionnaire. I think we're a little bit over that at the moment, but we want this to be practical, right? So that we want this to be useful. And I think something that's longer than an hour is probably something that people don't necessarily want to engage with. But that's our aim.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. Let's blend in right to our next question here. Instead of asking, why is open science useful? One could ask, how will science develop if we just, something got in my way of my screen here, if we just continue as usual?
Yes, sure, we can ask that question, but I think that's not the question that people are interested in. So when you talk to institutional leaders, what they want to do is, why is this useful for my institution? Why should I actually invest time and resources into it? So, you know, we have to think about the fact that they need to spend money, especially when it comes to developing infrastructure. It's also about money. So we need to get people to see that this is something that's useful from a selfish point of view, if you like. I think this is also the way that we get more researchers involved. We need to talk about not sort of what I tend to call the moral arguments of open science. I know there are moral arguments, and I love those. You know, that's why I am in the game. But I think that's not what works for most people who are interested, maybe in their scientific career and maybe in getting their institution running or running it successfully. So, you know, we have to find the arguments that work for them. And I think for them, it's really important to understand, you know, why is open science actually useful for your processes?
Yeah, fair enough. Very good. Our next question, please, if we can blend it in there. Was the tool developed in connection with potential users? And if so, how?
Yeah, sorry. I was hoping that was going to be quite clear in my presentation. But yeah, so we're developing this together with 3 universities. So that's the idea. They are the users. They have a couple of people who are now testing this, sort of sitting in front of their screen and clicking through the questions to see if it works for the institution.
Okay, very good. I'm looking through the screen here and the official, okay, our time is a little bit tight because we're going to be having our speakers corner in a moment. First of all, I'd like to also give you a virtual applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's clapping to a screen, but I try to get a little bit of feeling here in our conference of being together. And I believe you will also be joining our speakers corner, meet the speakers at 2:15 here in German time, Central European time. So that's in about 15 minutes.